Shall we push ahead?
Yes.
Okay. So now we're up to Unit 5.
Yes.
And we have practically, actually, we're only 1 unit behind. So we're storming the plan in the last days of the month. So here we are in Unit 5. Now, this is going to be some history of economic ideas, but I just want to mention the question of the collapse of civilizations, of decline. The usual texts you find in world history, right? World history, that is Spielvogel or Sponek or other people, they often do not devote too much attention to the issue of how civilizations collapse. And the word about civilizations, of course, is that they collapse from within, just as, actually more often than from the outside. The British tradition here is Arnold Toynbee of British intelligence, who has stuff to say about how, I think he's up to about 27 civilizations. And halfway through his work, he said, I'm not going to write about civilizations anymore. I'm going to avoid the civilizations and talk about universal churches, which corresponds to the British intelligence shift from attempting to provoke international conflict to an attempt to use the religions of the world for subversive and negative purposes. In other words, what we see today, the clash of civilizations when it's very often rooted in religion. So that goes back to this very evil British obscurantist. Now, if we look, for example, the collapse of Rome, what I'm working towards here is the death certificate for Rome, as well as for the Han Empire of China, is died of oligarchy, died of an atrophy of the power of the central government and the exorbitant growth of oligarchs, local, regional oligarchs. You'll remember that in Rome, you have the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and after the First Punic War, they said, look, what we should do in Rome is take the land we have conquered from Carthage and divide it up, have a land reform. We should have a lot of small farms, and we'll put the veterans who have fought the Punic Wars onto those small farms. That way we'll have a military class, we'll have agricultural production, we'll have a future. They were assassinated, both of them, by oligarchs who said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to build up a class of independent farmers. That would challenge our power. What we're going to do is have gang slavery in Sicily in particular. Sicily was the area that had been conquered from Carthage. So they said, we're not going to divide that up into small farms, family farms. No, we're not going to create a middle class. We're going to have oligarchs own it, and it's going to be mass agricultural slavery, gang slavery, which is different from the household slavery that you find in many places in the ancient world, and indeed in Saudi Arabia today. Saudi Arabia still has household slavery, which is harder to see. You go to Sicily today, it's arid. When did it become arid? It became arid after the failure of the Gracchi, because if it had been small family farms, it would have been flourishing. But no, it had to be slavery. And that then leads to the creation of the city mob and the policy of bread and circuses. And as we look forward to the Stupor Bowl in a week, we see that the policy of high unemployment, the city mob, and the panem et circenses, bread and circuses, the circenses, the Stupor Bowl. There was, under the Byzantine Empire, an attempt to not repeat this problem. The theme system, it's called, was an attempt to avoid having huge landed estates, latifundia, worked by slaves. They tried to have legal protections against it, but they did not succeed in that. The collapse of Han China at about the same time, right, 300, 400 AD, is very similar. You've got oligarchs who take over regions, they develop private armies, they have their own policies, they defy the central government, and the civilization collapses, right? The public works cannot be maintained, and so forth. Take a look at the parallelism between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Han Chinese at that time, and you'll see, died of oligarchy died of what you could call feudalism. Private armies, oligarchical power, a weakening of the central government. We could say more, but we have to push on. Now, in our modern world, we've got neo-feudalism, right? The idea that Walmart is a state within the state, or Wall Street immune to taxation. The private armies, well, you know, you had Cloven Bundy out there with his cloven hooves. And the idea with Cloven Bundy is somebody like that could easily become an armed gang in the service of some power, right? Whether it could be done openly or in a veiled manner. The weakening of the state in the modern world in the past 20 or 30 years, I think, threatens us with a repeat performance in some ways of that Rome and Han decline. So the answer is this: dirigism, we've talked about it, we gave you de Gaulle's definitions. Mercantilism, that's a somewhat older word. Protectionism and cameralism. Cameralism, das Kamerale, Kameralismus is the word that we had in the German-speaking area. So remember, in order to do this, you've got to have something that looks like a national state. And we always want to remember Milan, Italy, 1310, Dante and the Emperor Henry of Luxembourg install Gian Galeazzo Visconti in Milan. Well, he comes a bit later, but the Galeazzo, the Visconti dynasty, is there after 1310. And by 1390, Gian Galeazzo Visconti is about to unite all of northern and central Italy under one kingdom. He's going to overwhelm the Venetians or marginalize them, but he's very close to having Milan and Florence and the other areas up there. So southern Rome and south is less important at this time. This would have been obviously a huge enterprise. Remember that Milan was traditionally the richest city in Europe, other than perhaps Byzantium. And Milan is based on metalworking. Since we're talking about 1390, Milan is famous for having manufactured the swords and armor for the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1350 to 1453 or whatever it is, that made Milan a tremendously prosperous place. And therefore, this is where the nation state first emerges. One of Gian Galeazzo Visconti's gambits is he says to all kinds of people, you know, if you let me come and be your ruler, there's a lot of debt relief that's going to go on. A lot of haircuts are going to happen, right? I'm going to give you these benefits. And just the idea of imposing law and order, stopping the feudalists from their constant practice of private warfare. This is a great advantage. So the Italians undoubtedly lead the world in just about everything: science, geography, statecraft, literature. But it comes to an end, and it came to an end because Italy was very rich and very weak. It remained divided. Gian Galeazzo died at the wrong moment, so you were left with Venice, Milan, Florence, Papal States, and Naples. And divided 5 ways. They could not stand up to France, they could not stand up to Spain. And this wonderful, flourishing civilization, the Renaissance, that's basically what you have there, ended with invasions and the sack of Rome in 1527. It's a horrendous event. If you go to Rome, you don't find buildings, too many of them anyway, that are before 1527. If you want to find the Renaissance, you got to go to Florence because it was not quite destroyed in that way. The first nation state on a national scale is Louis XI of France, right? We're in the 1470s, 1480s. And his big problem is the Duke of Burgundy, who wants to have feudalism and private warfare. And Louis XI of France is able to defeat the Duke of Burgundy and to begin the process of French unification. He's also got various programs, like just the idea of weights and measures, right? That weights and measures should be uniform and that piracy and banditry and brigandage should be suppressed. The model here is the king unites with the bourgeoisie. The king unites with the middle class in the towns to crush the feudal nobility, those oligarchs that we've seen as always interfering with civilization. The same story here in England, Henry VII, the Earl of Richmond, right, the guy who defeats Richard III in the famous play. Here is a guy who he takes advantage of the fact that the English feudal nobility have been decimated in the 100 Years' War. That's the first advantage they had. And then, when they got home from the 100 Years' War, they then had the Wars of the Roses, and more of them got killed then. So he was able to come in and impose a new monarchy, a national Renaissance monarchy, due to the fact that the feudal forces had essentially killed each other off. That's one thing that they tend to do. Remember that oligarchs, it is to some degree a mistake to think that oligarchs are united. Oligarchs tend to be polycentric because they're always fighting each other. There's always a kind of a feudal internecine civil war going on among them. Now I have to remind you what the Arab world is learning today is that wars of religion between 1517 and 1648 have been a disaster in the West. Hopefully the West has learned from this, but some people obviously have not. Luther comes on the scene in 1517. You have wars in Germany, and then it turns into the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. It's just a disaster. Kills 1/3 to 1/2 of the people in Central Europe. And what you get out of this is religions, apocalyptic preachers in particular, always advance sweeping claims of supremacy. And you've got to bridle them. In other words, the civil magistrate, the government, the police power, the judges, the courts, have got to tell the apocalyptic preachers, thus far and no farther.
Yeah, you might be surprised to know that Calvin actually wrote about that. He was in favor of what you just said, among his many evils.
Except that in Geneva he sets up a theocracy. And I think Calvin, I have a very dark view of him. Here, let's go with Luther first. Luther, one of my contributions, I hope to have a new book by 2017. We're going to have the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation with Luther. My view of Luther is 1517 is still in the era of the War of the League of Cambrai. And it is a time when all of Europe has ganged up on the Venetians. It's called the War of the League of Cambrai. The Venetians take tremendous military defeats. They're almost wiped out. But they fight back in their particular way by sending apocalyptic preachers out on the roads to Florence. Savonarola is one from the same period. But above all, they reach out to somebody. They say, there's this guy in central Germany who seems to have some, rather incendiary opinions. Well, let's send somebody up there and activate him. And it's Luther. The goal being to create a war in Germany to relieve pressure on Venice during the War of the League of Cambrai. So Venetian asset. Hope to have that book out before. Now, Calvin is a somewhat more complicated story, but the idea here is theologically, absolute predestination and total depravity. This is a radical departure from what Christianity had meant.
And the denial of human reason.
Yeah, right. Luther, of course, according to Luther, human reason is the bride and whore of the devil. It's bad. It's a Manichaean view that the world of faith is good, but this world is essentially evil, right? Things of this world are evil. So this is very problematic. And then Calvin takes it even further, right? It's even more extreme. And what the thing that's suspicious about Calvin is he, at a time when the Venetians need France to be destabilized, he sends his apocalyptic preachers into France. It's called the Evangelical Ministry of Calvin to France in the 1550s, 1560s. And this gives rise to the Huguenots and to a period of 25 years of civil wars. And out of that, right, since we had Charlie Hebdo, the French learned to observe that principle, what I just said, that you cannot let apocalyptic preachers run your society. You've got to have a government. And the guy who does this is King Henry IV, the guy who says Paris is worth a mass. In other words, political power is worth more to me than religious orthodoxy. This is the beginning of a sensible view. So he's able to contain and control the competing radical Catholics of the Guise family and the Protestants of this Huguenot faction. Turns out the Huguenots, the great Protestant party, the Calvinist party, it's all the top nobility. And those people had been rebelling against the French monarchy before and after. When you look at France, you say the one thing that's always true is the French nobility are revolting. And they were rebelling in the 1400s with the Duke of Burgundy. They became Calvinists in the 1500s. Then they became libertines, right? They became atheists into the 1700s, and then after the revolution, they're all Catholic again. And the goal is to be against whoever is king in power. Henry VIII, the story of England, right? The Protestant Reformation here, under the influence of what I would call Venetian advisors, he separates himself from the Roman Church and founds the Church of England. However, at the same time, in Italy, the Medici of Florence do have a policy of economic development based on the textile industry, right, from 1400 to 1500. So here we can begin to see some of the roots of modern economics. Let's jump, though, to France, to the great Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister under Louis XIV. This is one of the main sources of dirigism, protectionism, mercantilism, and so forth. His idea is, let us remove the feudal residues of internal tolls, internal tariffs, differentiated tax systems, keep pushing on the uniform weights and measures, and then great projects of infrastructure. The Canal du Midi. If you want to go from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, you don't want to go through Gibraltar because the British are waiting for you there. So you need to avoid that. What do you do? And it's beautiful. This is not the Tennessee Tom Bigby. This is now the Canal du Midi, 1666, and this is what it looks like. And at the time that this was built, this was just a huge project, right? What? I don't know. It might add up to 100 miles if you put it all together. He's using rivers. Let's take a look at it. You want to go from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Well, the Canal du Midi from Sète to Toulouse, and then the Canal de Garonne, and then down here, and you exit through this area, right? Bordeaux, I guess, is over here. Right? Now, for 1666, that's a pretty ambitious project. He's about 100 years before the British. Beats the British to the punch by 100 years. But, of course, the British do catch up. Infrastructure. You got four main rivers. You have the Thames. You have the Severn. You have the Mersey. And you have the Trent. And you've got to link those four with canals. And then you've got the basis for an industrial revolution. So the infrastructure comes first. As the Italians used to say, you can't build a cathedral in the desert. You've got to have infrastructure first, and then the big factories, plants, reactors will follow. There is an important story of how Benjamin Franklin encouraged, I think it's the Duke of Bridgewater, to build these canals up here. But there is an impulse, right, that Franklin was thinking, gosh, if I could get these people interested in production rather than looting, they might relax their pressure on the North American colonies. There is a Neapolitan school in Naples, and it extends into Latin America in the 1700s. Worthy of mention, here is Antonio Serra, brief treatise on the causes that can bring abundance to kingdoms and, well, anyway, not a good, even when there are no mines, even if there are no mines. So Dr. Antonio Serra, and here we are back, this is in the 1500s, right? This is when it actually came out. This is 1613, but I think the book is older. So there's a dirigist school coming out of Naples. Of course, I think we've given enough attention to this awful GIAMMARIA ORTES. He is the basis of BENTHAM and MALTHUS. I think we have this from our previous sessions. Now, Alexander Hamilton, coming from the West Indies, he is, among other things, a reader of Machiavelli. He has Machiavelli books in his trunk. This is demonstrable, right? The records have been preserved. And after being an officer for George Washington in the Continental Army, and a key guy there, becomes the founder of the U.S. federal government. There's no way around it. This government here, for good or ill, he founded it. He made it work. He had the sense to do that, and became the first Secretary of the Treasury. So what does he do in that capacity? The report on the public credit. He says, you've got to have a funded public debt. This is the time when the United States is peripheral to Europe and other more important powers. So you're going to need to borrow money from Europe in order to push your own development. So he says it's going to take a funded public debt. Buy the debts of the states accrued during the Revolutionary War. Federal government takes those over and pays them. With that, you've established credit, and you can then begin to do more important things. Obviously, the opposite argument is that helps rich people. Unfortunately, that's the way it has to be. The poorer people who had bought these loans from the states had sold them off at depreciated prices. But still, the benefit for the country was overwhelming. And as a kind of an extension of the report on the public credit, the report on the bank, you've got to have a national bank. This is a step beyond most places in Europe. We're going to get to this in a minute. And then he says, look, we've also got to industrialize. We've got to have the report on manufacturers. People should read this today, right? It's largely been rolled back.
But so who owns the National Bank?
The shareholders. Yeah. Well, one of them is interesting. One of them is Talleyrand. You know Talleyrand? He's a bishop of the old regime who becomes a foreign minister under the Revolution and Napoleon. And he says, my shares in the Bank of the United States are great. The Bank in the United States became one of the biggest entities, concerns in the world. The point is not who owns it. That's what I say today. Don't ask me who owns the Federal Reserve, who controls the policies. That's how you see who controls it. And without that bank, the United States would have been dead, gone within 20 years.
The public could own it.
Huh?
The public.
Well, today we want the public to own it, right? That's different. But the historical fact is that this had private shares. But the idea is, what are you trying to do? You've got to have a line of defense between you and the Bank of England and the London market, because otherwise the British are going to attack you. The British had something known as the Death Watch. It's Lord Shelburne. He says, you got your independence in 1783. Let's see you keep it. With free trade and no national bank, you'll be destroyed. And under the Articles of Confederation, it almost happened. You almost had civil war among states. So the other idea is, who's going to put out money? Just the availability of money, cash in any form, is absolutely indispensable. So you've got to have something that insulates you from the London financial market, because otherwise they can bankrupt you at any time, and they will, for political and geopolitical reasons. And you're providing money, and you're also backing certain critical investments. Let's just see. Let me see. Oh, yeah, look. Let's see what happens when you don't have it. That's the best way to see it. The first Bank of the United States goes from 1791 to 1811, 20-year charter. Okay. Once it's gone, what happens? The Astor interests, John Jacob Astor, financier from New York, and the Girard Bank of Philadelphia seized control of the U.S. public debt in 1811. As soon as you don't have your national bank, you're going to have predatory private interests come in their own right and simply take over everything. And what's the result? You know the War of 1812? We just had the anniversary here, right? Not so good, huh? The United States has no army and no navy to speak of. And you can't finance anything because you don't have the first bank of the United States. So the whole war, the first 2 years of the war, are a disaster. We've just had it, right? The burning of Washington 200 years ago last summer. And then the attack on Baltimore. Why was that possible? Because the Jefferson administration, Jefferson was one of the worst presidents. Jefferson is an awful president. That monument, the Jefferson Memorial, should be, I would say, torn down, but renamed, okay? Renamed. It's a nice copy of the Pantheon in Rome. This is the unforgivable opportunism of the Democratic Party. Because they said, oh, there's the Lincoln Memorial. Who do we get? And unfortunately, if you look at the Democratic Party in the 19th century, there's practically nobody. There were a couple, right? There's one guy who was for the tariff later on. Wasn't that the guy you read? Right?
Oh, Andrew Stewart?
Yeah. Wasn't he a Democrat? There were some Democrats who got the idea. But other than that, Andrew Jackson, these people, just awful. So the idea that you should have a memorial to Jefferson, the only good thing we can say about Jefferson is at the end of his life, he recanted. Right? He says, I was wrong. It's like a deathbed confession. Take a look. Isn't that in my... You were writing me the other day that that's in Surviving the Cataclysm.
You quote Andrew Stewart, but it's in that book that he includes a letter from Thomas Jefferson where Jefferson was on an age, and you can't teach an old dog new tricks apparently, because better late than never, Jefferson did say, oh yeah, a country has to take care of its own manufacturers, that type of thing.
So Jefferson repudiated most of his own stuff. The problem with Jefferson and Madison especially is that once you had independence, they were captured by slaveholding interests. It's just that simple. They said, we want to have a weak government with a weak army. We don't want to have an army because the army might come and abolish slavery. Right? So that's the whole thing in a nutshell. They're protecting slavery, and they want a weak government and no industrial power and everything backward. So the abolition, the ending of the first Bank of the United States, the Hamilton one, leads you into the debacle of the War of 1812. And then, once you get it back, now you start building some canals, right? You get the Erie Canal in the 1820s. DeWitt Clinton.
There you go.
We're fortunate here to have a descendant of DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York. The Second Bank of the United States, 1816 to 1836. What happens when that's abolished? The Panic of 1837. It was the worst depression in the history of the U.S. up until that time, comes when this is no longer there. So the British, as soon as it's gone, the British attack and everything is shut down. That means the whole economic development of the U.S. is aborted and you're on the slide into civil war. The cotton interest, the slave interest comes back. They're resurgent. There's no industrial strength in the South. Remember one of our friends, Cassius Clay, the real Cassius Clay, Lincoln's ambassador to Russia. He was from Kentucky. His program was, I want to industrialize the South. I want to create an industrial class here that will be a counterweight to these crazy slave barons, right? So that would have been the Royal Road, and it still would be. The first Bank of the United States, and then the second. Here's the second. It's there. It's in Philadelphia. Go see it. What a beautiful building. And Jackson, of course, Andrew Jackson, was a lunatic. He had some phobia about it. Remember, Andrew Jackson is a protege of Aaron Burr. Andrew Jackson's beginnings, his political career, starts when he's part of Aaron Burr's conspiracy to foment secession in western and southern parts. So a thorough scoundrel, terrible president, but of course the opportunist, when you go, the Democratic Party typically has the Jeff-Jack dinner, the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. Can we find two greater villains? Now, John Marshall of Virginia. This is a founding father. So he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the opinion that we want to talk about here is McCulloch versus Maryland, because the Maryland government tried to interfere with the Bank of the United States, and Marshall provides the eternal refutation of Jefferson, because Jefferson says, look, there are these enumerated powers, right, in the Constitution. There's a list. But then there's also the so-called elastic clause, which says all laws necessary and proper to pursue the goals that are outlined in this Constitution. Read it. The enumerated powers are there, very good, and then there's the elastic clause. All laws necessary and proper. Of Jefferson, the other benefit, the one thing nice we can say about Jefferson is he had the sense not to believe his own stupid lying propaganda. Because when the Louisiana Purchase comes along, he gets out the Constitution, he looks at the enumerated powers, right? To buy land from other countries, it's not there. But of course he had the sense to buy Louisiana, because otherwise it would have been a disaster. So he didn't follow his own lunatic doctrine. But Marshall goes further. Marshall says we have in effect the implied powers. If the action of the government pursues the goals that are set out in the Constitution and does not do anything that's expressly forbidden, then it's constitutional. And remember, to provide for the common defense and to provide for the general welfare, to promote the general welfare and the common defense and the other goals in the preamble, that's very broad, right? The general welfare is very broad. You put the general welfare, and remember, it's got that in there twice. The common defense and the general welfare appear in the preamble and also in the tasks of Congress. So the general welfare twice. Anything that pursues the general welfare that is not expressly forbidden is constitutional. And that's the great John Marshall, right, who saved the country repeatedly. And, of course, that also meant that you can have a Bank of the United States, right? So it means that the whole libertarian demagogy falls to the ground. John Quincy Adams is another important exponent of the American system. A lot of this has to do with the promotion of science, the promotion of inventions. A lot of canal building goes on still under John Quincy Adams. So this is highly positive. Andrew Jackson wrecks the Bank of the United States, and that causes immediately the Panic of 1837, but it also slows down the economic development, as we said, so we get into the Civil War. Friedrich List is this wonderful international figure. He's very famous in Japan. There were all kinds of articles some years ago in the Atlantic Monthly by James Fallows saying, I'm here in Japan and everybody talks about Friedrich List. Who is that guy? Right? So the people in Japan who wanted economic development knew Friedrich List. His big polemic is free trade is not an objective rule of economics. It's a British trick. That free trade fits the British needs very well. It suppresses everybody else, allows them to dump, keeps everybody backward. But for the rest of the world, free trade is a plague, anathema, Friedrich List. And his own, he is really the father of modern Germany. The Zollverein, or customs union, in Germany was the problem of uniting groups as disparate as the Prussians and the Bavarians and the Rhinelanders. These are very different kinds of people, right? So how do you get them together? Friedrich List does it, so to speak, behind their backs. We'll unite you, we'll have a customs union first, and that can grow into a political union. And within 30 or 40 years, it did. So that's the origin of Germany. A customs union, Prussia and these other smaller states, Saxony, I guess, and Hanover, they become part of the customs union, and then they begin to gravitate together. So that would be sort of the story of the European Union, right? That it starts as a customs union, and it goes towards political unification, but of course the question is under what auspices and with what program. Henry Clay is certainly one of the most important figures. It is he who gives the name of the American system to this entire thing. He's known, you've known him as the great compromiser. Okay, he was that. He was Irenic, he was conciliatory. But the main thing is he wanted the Whig Party to become an engine for the American system. What does it go through? A protective tariff, a national bank, and the creation of infrastructure at federal expense, even if the infrastructure is only in one state, one city. That's immaterial, right? Again, something in San Francisco or New York or New Orleans, those are going to be of national importance, even though if they're located in one county. Who cares about this, right? This is ridiculous.
Marysville Road or
the Maysville Road, the Maysville Road, yeah. So there are lots of them. And of course, Abraham Lincoln is a direct disciple of Henry Clay. The bank, the protective tariff, and infrastructure. So are we advocating anything much different now? In effect, we're still on the Henry Clay line. Cavour we went through. Henry Carey. We had Matthew Carey earlier in the 19th century, Henry Carey. You remember the Wharton School of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania? The charter specifies that the purpose of the Wharton School is to promulgate the doctrines of Henry Carey. And our late friend now, Louis DuPont Smith of Philadelphia, went to the Wharton School some years ago, and he buttonholed professors, and he said, "What can you tell me about Henry Carey?" And the answer was, "Who's that?" So the endowed professors at the Wharton School are now teaching financial engineering and derivatives, and they've forgotten about Henry Carey. And the idea here is this is essentially a continuation of the same general direction we see in List. He's absolutely in favor of a protective tariff, absolutely in favor of the great projects of infrastructure and an entire development strategy. Later on goes on with the Philadelphia interests were historically better than New York in the sense that New York early on fell under the influence of the Astors and the Belmonts, but in Philadelphia there were some other financiers who were better. Jay Cooke comes to mind, right? The guy, during the Civil War, the United States savings bonds were inaugurated by Jay Cooke, who would send out salespeople to tap into the savings of average citizens, right? In other words, some of the snooty New York financiers, Astor and Belmont, might not want to buy U.S. savings bonds or government bonds, but the average person did. So those were the Philadelphia interests. And it was also grouped around a company called Baldwin Locomotive. Baldwin locomotives were exported to the world. Russia got them. I don't know whether Perry had those too, but Baldwin Locomotive was a real powerhouse. And the Philadelphia faction, Alexander Dallas Bache, there was later on a stock firm called Bache and Company, but this is the background, the people who supported Henry Carey. The Lincoln administration we've done. The Confederates. Well, what can we say? The Confederate Constitution of 1861, you should read it. It's a parody of the U.S. Constitution. It's an evil parody. And one of the principles of the Constitution, it says, it's an article, that you're not allowed to have a protective tariff. It said you can have a revenue tariff, which in those days meant something, 5%, something like that, but no protective tariff. It was absolutely forbidden according to the Confederate Constitution. And what did this do? It simply perpetuated the backwardness and the underdevelopment of these areas, right? The Lincoln proposal was that Alabama, especially, could be a great setter of steel, siderurgy, and that could have been done. And this is the kind of thing that Henry Clay and Cassius Clay being a cousin of Henry Clay, wanted to do. But the Confederate Constitution says no, free trade only. Another great guy from Vermont, Justin Morrill. As soon as the Confederate officials left the Congress, they immediately passed a protective tariff, right? The first one really ever. This is 1861-62. The Morrill tariff, the first protective tariff, and the U.S. economy begins to take off, headed towards surpassing the British, 15, 20 years later. And he's also the one with the Homestead Act. So it's one of the greatest land reforms in world history. This is avoiding what the Gracchi failed to do, right? It's correcting the mistake of the Gracchi back in Rome. And it's got the land-grant colleges built in, right? From Cornell on west, all goes back to this. So education, science, the creation of a middle class, and I think he had a lot to do with the the Transcontinental Railroad in the same time. So there you get the idea. You have the protective tariff, the greenbacks. It's a controlled currency, not dependent on the London gold market, the Homestead Act, and the maintenance of a single national market. Now, of course, don't want to take that too far. It can be regulated, can and should be regulated, but it's essentially a single market. Now, in the history of Germany, Bismarck had succeeded in uniting Germany about 1870, 71, and he didn't have an economic policy. So Germany began to drift. It was going nowhere. It might have fallen apart again, except that Bismarck, sympathetic to the United States, right? Certainly his sympathies were all with Lincoln during the Civil War. Bismarck also helped the United States by pinning down Napoleon III. By having an army on the Rhine, Bismarck essentially said to Napoleon, you send your army to attack the U.S., maybe I'll come in and get you, right? If you send your army away. So there was always a lot of sympathy for Prussia in the United States. But at this point, Bismarck says, hey, wait a minute, look at that U.S. result, right? Look at what they're getting with the protective tariff. Man, I'm going to have a protective tariff too. And he did. And at that point, Germany took off to be the biggest industrial power in continental Europe. So the benefits of Lincoln in the Civil War, the industrialization of Germany, if it hadn't been for Lincoln, the British would never have allowed Canada to become a country. They would have kept it divided. They felt that, hey, we better have a country here, otherwise we might get gobbled up. And then, of course, the right to vote, the British Reform Bill of 1867 that allows British workers to vote. That was also because they were also afraid of what Lincoln or the United States might do to them. So the progress of Canada, Britain, Germany, all spinning off. And remember, in China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of the people, the idea of a democratic republic, national sovereignty, and people's livelihood, this is thought to be derived from the Gettysburg Address. Of the people, the sovereign republic, by the people, representative government, for the people, economic development. Of the people, by the people, and for the people. So that's the Chinese interpretation of the Gettysburg Address. So that's a pretty good catalog, right? Lincoln helping Canada, Britain, Germany, China, and more, right? There's also Thailand was on the side of the U.S. during that. But here's the problem. The Wall Street bankers regroup. Once the war has stopped, people go back to alienated lives in many ways, and the crime of 1873, the Specie Resumption Act. The United States returns the gold payment, and it's, for the farmers, a disaster. Remember again, all money is fiat money. The crime of 1873 is specie meaning gold and silver, and then the Coin Act. And what I'm really quoting here is I'm quoting populist propaganda from the 1880s and the 1890s, right? Those Nebraska populists who met in Omaha in 1890, they refer to this as the deed done in the dead of night, the Act and the Coin Act. And the result of that is deflation. So that if you're a farmer, the prices you get go down, 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 and what you have to pay to retire your debt in real dollars goes up, up, up. So there's a scissors crisis. Right? The scissors open up and the farmer gets his head chopped off. Prices are going down, and the value of the dollar he has to repay. He borrowed cheap dollars, now he's got to repay expensive ones. So
Why does the dollar go up then?
because it's the U.S. has returned to the gold standard, and there is development, but the development is somehow turned against the farmer. In other words, it's a gold dollar now. In other words, if I lend you a paper dollar and I make you repay me a gold dollar, can you smell a fault? If the dollar you pay me is worth 3 or 4 times the dollar that I lent you, you've been had. So that's what it is.
Just because it's gold, it goes up?
It's gold, yes. It goes up until the British decide to turn it around and drive it back down again in the 1890s. We'll get to that. So the populists are mainly concerned with that. Now this is 1895. By the time we get to Grover Cleveland, now he's the first Democrat to be elected president after the Civil War. And those suspicions turned out to be founded. He was from New York State. But here's the idea. In 1895, the British have a crisis. The Barings Bank goes bankrupt. You have the Venezuelan debt crisis, 1895. And the British decide, as often happens, if a crisis emerges, you can dump it on somebody else. You can judo a crisis so that it doesn't hit you, it hits somebody else. The Bank of England and so forth start a run on the U.S. gold stocks, right? Because in those days, it's the gold system, and you're shipping gold, literally, back and forth as a means of international payment. You put gold on ships and send it, where it's going. The British begin dumping dollars and demanding gold. Dumping dollars, demanding gold, and eventually it looks like the U.S. gold stocks are going to run out. Grover Cleveland goes on his knees to J.P. Morgan and says, "Please, sir, don't destroy my dollar by taking the last of the gold." And J.P. Morgan says, "Okay, my masters in London will allow you to exist, but Morgan will control the U.S. public debt. Morgan and London take over the U.S. public debt, and you do what we want from now on." And so it was. So this is 1895. This is one of the turning points of history, and as I think I've argued already in our classes, all this stuff about Jekyll Island, yeah, that's all well and good, but the ideas, the real essence of the Federal Reserve System starts in 1895, that London and Morgan control the U.S. public debt. That was what was established in that meeting with Grover Cleveland on his knees and J.P. Morgan telling him what he was going to do. So from this point on, you've got the Federal Reserve System. And what it says again is, if you don't have a national bank, be it 1811, 1837, or 1895, or 1914, if you don't have a national bank, then financiers and foreigners will control your finances. Now remember that central banks in general, there's the Bank of England, privately owned, the Bank of France. You should read or listen to very interesting lectures online from the French historian Henri Guillemin, Guillemin. The Bank of France was a private company with shares, and in order to buy the shares, it was like getting into a club. You had to be approved to get your hands on the shares. Everybody wanted the shares because it was money and status, but not everybody was even allowed to buy it. And it was a private, for-profit entity. So the shareholders got big dividends out of this thing. So the tradition of the central banks is simply bad. Now, World War I, in a nutshell. The U.S. is selling to Britain and France on credit. And by late 1916, early 1917, the British and the French are about to collapse. Now, that would have been a good thing. If the British and the French had collapsed at the end of 1916, after the Somme and after Verdun, then the war would have ended, right? But no, the British want to keep it going. So we have the U.S. ambassador to London, Walter Hines Page. His name was long synonymous with the most extreme Anglophilia in the U.S. ruling class. He sends a letter to Wilson, and he says, "Dear Mr. President, the British and the French are about to go bankrupt. If they do, Morgan will go bankrupt, New York will go bankrupt, and our country will be thrown into a depression, and you'll be blamed. So we need you to enter the war. And this is printed by George Seldes in a recent book. So the Walter Hines Page letter, there's no doubt about it. He says, we've got to declare war soon because otherwise the British and French will go down and then we'll be bankrupt. At the end of this, we have the reparations that are imposed on Germany. So it's $80 billion at 5%, which was very high for those days. The Germans, I believe, just finished paying. Am I right? Germany just finished paying within the last 5 years. Huh? They pay. Well, they didn't pay at all, right? They couldn't pay at all, but you get the idea. That, of course, meant that the entire world economy was strangled. Keynes wrote his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, that this was going to be a disaster, that it was a guarantee of another war, of course, and ultimately the beneficiary of the reparations was Hitler, because that's the basis of his demagogy. Now, after World War I, the libertarians tell us that there was something called the Depression of 1920, and it was deliberately created by the Bank of England. I think the Bank of England said, hey, the U.S. is really going great guns these days, right? At the beginning of the war, the British were the world's banker. They were the creditors of the world. And after World War I, the British were the debtors of the United States. And this they did not like. So using the tremendous power of the Bank of England, right, you can increase the discount rate and suck in hot money from the world. The New York market will then collapse, stock market. They did it. So the 1920s depression. And the libertarians say, that's what we should have today. This is what they want. This is the kind of deflation they like. They say it was a short depression, it was very deep, it was devastating, but it was over soon. It was over in a couple of years. Too bad if you died. Right? But they say this is their model. People like Peter Schiff, when Peter Schiff ran for Senate from Connecticut, he said, unemployment needs to be higher. We've got to burn out this crisis. Well, the problem with this is it was short in the United States. But after this 1920 depression, the British unemployment went to 3 to 4 million and stayed there all through the 1920s. And that was considered the highest unemployment in any country in world history recently. The British. Led to a British general strike, the despair, just awful. And in Italy, in 1922, October 1922, this wonderful libertarian depression gave us Mussolini fascism. It set the stage for the collapse of the Italian government and Mussolini's march on Rome. So they think this was great. The libertarians say the 1920 depression is a model for what we should do today. No stimulus, no QE, no nothing, deflationary crash, and then everything is hunky-dory. Again, hopefully. So we have this guy, Thomas Woods. He's a rock star of the Poltard world, right? And he's an Austrian, and he says, yeah, Harding, Warren Gamaliel in 1921 to 1922, that was laissez-faire, right? Let the crisis burn itself out, and then cut government spending. And that then created what Wikipedia calls a recovery, but was in effect the bubble economy of the 1920s. In other words, you're then headed towards the crash of 1929 as a result of this. So this is what the libertarians want. Is that clear to everybody? This is Ron Paul's program. This is what he wants. And Rand, I don't know. If Rand is in a crisis, you imagine President Rand Paul in a crisis and he falls back on this, which is what he's been taught. Now, that was an entire group. I'll just sum it up. There was a guy called Andrew Mellon, the Mellon Bank, Mellon Interests of Pittsburgh. The word is that the Republican presidents of the 1920s served under Andrew Mellon. That is to say, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, at least for a while, were the puppets of Andrew Mellon. And when the crash of 1929 approached and broke out, the word we had from Andrew Mellon was liquidationism, which is another way to say, let's have a deflationary crash. And Andrew Mellon's a famous quote, it's in the book, liquidate stocks, liquidate bonds, liquidate real estate. Everything crashes down, and then you'll have a recovery. So the libertarians today are actually, they try to pretend they're for Calvin Coolidge. That's bad enough. But they're really for Andrew Mellon. Liquidate stocks, liquidate bonds, liquidate, I guess they would say derivatives, liquidate the farmer, liquidate industry, liquidate everything. And it's just, the other term for this, I have it here somewhere, the economist Joseph Schumpeter, or Schumpeter sometimes called, his word is creative destruction. Let's have an exercise in creative destruction. Liquidate stocks, liquidate bonds, liquidate real estate. And again, all I can say is, too bad if you died. Right? That's all great if you're sitting on a pile of money and in some kind of a feudal castle with a private army. But we don't have that. Winston Churchill is one of the evil forces of the 20th century. In the 1920s, the British had gone off the gold standard, and then they returned to it, right around 1924 or so. But Churchill wanted to peg the pound to gold at a very high rate, about 10 or 15 or 20% above what would have been reasonable. And the reason for that is Churchill didn't care about exports. He said, we used to be the workshop of the world, and British industry, forget all that. We just want to be able to buy up everything. So we want a high pound. If we had a low pound, we could export. Forget that. We want a high pound. We're going to buy up real estate and other things all over the world. So he pegs the pound to gold at a very high rate, and then he finds that he has a hard time defending it. The British unemployment, of course, goes up because the exports have dried up, the kind of thing we're probably going to see in some countries around now. But during the 1920s, the nucleus of what became the International Monetary Fund was a private cabal of central bankers. Benjamin Strong of Morgan and Bankers Trust, and Lord Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. And these were people who met privately, socially, right, at clubs. And they said, well, here's what we'll do. The pound is too high, but we're going to print a lot of dollars. We're going to start inflating the dollar to relieve pressure on the pound. So we're going to generate QE. We're going to generate a lot of hot money. We're going to put dollars into circulation. So the dollar will be weaker, and the pound won't appear to be so much out of whack. And what did that do? That hot money, QE, went into a stock bubble in Wall Street. And about, 2 months, 6 weeks before the crash, the British then reversed their field, and they raised their bank rate by 1 full percentage point. And we had the hot money flee New York and rush to London. And at that point, you have the crash of 1929. The crash of 1929 was deliberately engineered by Lord Montague Norman and the Bank of England. So he stabbed his friend Benjamin Strong in the back. And out of that clique grows what you today call the International Monetary Fund and its similar institutions. The Depression, the end of the world, as some bankers put it, September 21st, 1931, was when the Bank of England went off the gold standard. Up until that time, the world monetary system had been based on a pound sterling bill of exchange drawn on London. But that became impossible when the British went to a floating rate system, right, with constant fluctuation after September 1931. So I'm mentioning this because you do not want to accept this idea that the Depression of the 1930s was somehow caused by the United States in any way or by the Hawley-Smoot protective tariff. No. It was caused by the bankruptcy of the Bank of England, September 21st, 1931, after which the British embarked on what they called the bigger my neighbor policy, to manipulate your own currency to let people bear the brunt for you. So we've talked about Roosevelt and the New Deal. Let's just, we're getting close to running out of time. Today, there are four main ways to respond to a depression. And again, the Ron Paul, Rand Paul, libertarian, von Hayek, von Mises, Thomas Woods, have an immediate deflationary crash. They have a hard time saying this, but sometimes they do. This is what they want. Second possibility is what Bernanke and now Yellen have done. Hot money, quantitative easing, buy-up derivatives. Draghi has now entered this camp. There was the Keynesian stimulus of the U.S. stimulus and supplemental bills of 2009, and that has some positive effect, but then when the money is gone, you're back to where you were. The fourth possibility is the one we demand, the nationalization of the central bank, to act at least in part as a national bank, and it is the Lautenbach-Voitinsky solution. Lautenbach of the German finance ministry and Vladimir Voitinsky of the German Trade Union Federation. Right? So in Europe, this should be a no-brainer. Right? We need a faction in Austria and Germany and such places, and Italy, France, to come out in favor of this. In other words, if Syriza wins the election, to have a southern European bloc to try to take over the European Central Bank. We've already talked about Andrew Mellon and Schumpeter. The Keynesian borrow and spend hasn't worked. The hot money, quantitative easing hasn't worked. So what you've got to do is transform your central bank into a national bank. And the watchword is cheap credit for production. Another useful way to put this is credit as a public utility with regulation, right? Under the Public Utility Holding Company Acts and similar things. We now have in many places, or we had electricity and water as a public utility. Not for profit, but for a reasonable margin, but not for some kind of speculative killing. So credit as a public utility, 0% century bonds for production, and a Main Street window, an infrastructure window. I hope this will be brought home to the Chicago Fed at the first possibility. Yes. Anything? Now the one we haven't mentioned so far, Lend-Lease. This is an example of the late New Deal. This is now the build-up for the defense mobilization in World War II. It is through Lend-Lease that U.S. Economy got to full employment during 1941, before Pearl Harbor, practically with full employment before December 7th, 1941. And the trick here was, as Churchill had to recognize, that with the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt had taken over the credit mechanism and then, in effect, partially nationalized the Federal Reserve. And it goes like this. If you had a defense contract, the defense contract had a vendor number on it and a contract number, you could take that defense contract to your local commercial bank and discount it. You could get working capital. You can say, here's a contract, I'm going to build tanks for $10 million. You could go to your local banker and start getting that $10 million paid out, because the local banker knew that once he had that defense contract and that number in hand, he could go to the Federal Reserve and say, guess what, give me the money. So you're forcing the Fed at low interest rates, right? The U.S. went through World War II with the main interest rates in the area of 1% to 2% at the very most compared to what you have. So Lend-Lease, in effect, succeeded in a partial nationalization of the Federal Reserve.
Webster, it's 2:30. 3 people have to leave for their planes.
Okay.
And we're going to take a half-hour lunch break.
Okay.
That's a good time.
Yeah, I guess so.
Nope.